If you had asked me back in 2009 if there was anything manlier and more heterosexual than two sweaty men grappling each other on a blood-soaked canvas while trying to make the other man submit, I probably would have said, "Who are you and what are you doing in my house?" In the early 2000s, mixed martial arts was the fastest growing sport on earth. While it took me a little while to take to it, once I did, I was hooked. Seeing guys like George St-Pierre, Rich Franklin, Rampage Jackson make the sport grow into the absolute behemoth that it is today are some of my most nostalgic memories. The way that people gush about WWF back in the 80s and 90s with their Bret Harts, their Hulk Hogans, their Chris Benoits, that's how I feel about early 2000s UFC. And really, no company pushed this as hard as the UFC. Started in 1993, the UFC was a complete fucking shit show. You had a guy with a boxing glove taped onto his hand, you had a sumo wrestler, a kickboxer, all sorts of dudes, each with their own unique fighting style. It was like Street Fighter, but real life. But it's this man right here, Hoist Gracie, that shocked the world by beating a man he honestly had no business beating. But he did it using the single greatest tool a fighter could ever have, physics. Using his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he made sports history by showing that you don't have to just be strong to win. You need to be smart too. This shook the martial arts community practically overnight, and BJJ gyms were opening up left and right throughout the late 90s and the early 2000s. By 2002, the UFC was airing on cable television. I remember watching fights on Spike TV back in the day at around 6 p.m., surfing through channels and coming on to wrestling was actually pretty common back then, but this wasn't wrestling. This was real. In fact, it was as real as it gets. Yeah, that was the slogan back then. And as it blew up, it started getting merchandise. You had UFC hats, you had shirts, you had action figures, you had a mini octagon for your UFC toys to duke it out in so you could relive your favorite moments in the comfort of your own bedroom. But then, it happened. The thing that pushes sports into legitimacy. It got its very first video game on the Sega Dreamcast, which I don't own, so no review for that yet. But in 2009, the unexpected happened. After 5 years, UFC video games were going high def. Yeah! With UFC Undisputed 2009, in fact, for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. I was 16 at the time, and with no disposable income, I couldn't quite afford the game. Hell, I didn't even have the system to play it on. But my brother's friend downloaded the demo, and I probably spent hours on that demo alone. So after 12 years, I'm going to finally play the full retail version of UFC 2009 Undisputed. So, grab a Zions energy drink, slip on a tap-out t-shirt, and let's, as they say, get it on. God, this fucking title screen, this is a pure time capsule if I've ever seen one. If somebody tells you that you can't hear images, just show them this title screen. They might look at you funny, but if you know, you know. The game isn't packing a whole ton in the way of game modes, but what it does have are pretty good for a first attempt. You have your standard exhibition mode where you choose from one of 5 weight classes and go head to head with either a friend or the CPU. Pretty standard stuff, nothing new in terms of fighting or sports games. But it's always good to have it, and you know what? It's pretty fun in a social setting. The roster is really solid for the time, with guys like Brock Lesnar, GSP, Nate Diaz, Forrest Griffin. Pretty much anyone who was anyone in the organization back in 2009 is here, with varying degrees of accuracy in how they're represented. Yeah, some fighters might look a little off, that's not a new thing, but for the most part, they look alright. Worse is that there's no southpaw stance, meaning that guys like Rich Franklin fight orthodox. Sorry, lefties. There are also some weird omissions in the roster, like Clay Guida, Randy Couture, and Shane Carwin are nowhere to be seen. Especially weird for Shane Carwin, as he was really starting to blow up at this time. The two modes that make up the meat of this game are Classic Fights and Career Mode.
Classic Fights allows players to relive some of the most iconic fights at the time, like Chuck Liddell vs. Rampage or Chuck Liddell vs. Tito Ortiz, but no Chuck Liddell vs. Capcom, not yet at least. Give it time. While this mode allows you to pick whichever fighter you might prefer, there's special bonuses for picking a certain one and ending the fight in the same way it did in real life. These rewards come in the form of clips from the actual fights.
You know, nowadays we take things like YouTube and UFC Fight Pass for granted, but back in the day you couldn't really just watch fights whenever you wanted. So being able to unlock little snippets of fights or full fights in a video game to watch at your pleasure was kind of a novelty. This was a pretty neat reward if you were a big UFC fan back in 2009. I mean, growing up I never got to see a lot of the major fights. I couldn't fork out the cash for the pay-per-views. And UFC on Spike was kind of a crapshoot. It was a compilation of fights. It wasn't that you weren't watching the fights live, and you could only really watch them at a specific time. I think it was 6 or 7 p.m. is what I remember. And even back in the day, my parents wouldn't let me watch it, even though I was like 13 or 14. Maybe because early 2000s MMA was a little more violent than it is now. It's kind of the Wild West. You had 12 to 6 elbows fucking everywhere.
Now, on to the main course of the game, career mode. This is the part where I'll be talking about the controls and actual game mechanics. Our first order of business is to make our fighter. I messed around with the customization options for a bit, but coming from just about any other game with custom characters, this creation system is a slog to go through. They only show you so many options at a time, and you have to click on them to see what they look like on your fighter. So for the sake of this review, I just used a pre-made fighter. Meet Tom Big Nasty Jackson. He is a kickboxer and very little else. He's got this derpy looking face that for whatever reason or another puts the biggest smile on my face. Like, this guy looks like he should be selling me neckties and not putting me in them. After perfecting your pugilist, we have a cutscene where the president of the UFC, Dana White, takes the time out of his busy schedule to come down to my ho-hum little fighting gym in the middle of ass-fuck nowhere Canada just so he can rain on my parade. Like, get out of here with that negativity, you Lex Luthor looking fuck! Putting people down? Bitch! That's my job! The cutscene ends with him saying the line, and as soon as you begin playing, you kind of feel like something is a little off. I felt it back when playing the demo in 2009, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The game is, for lack of a better term, clunky. There's a lot of weight to how your fighter moves. Movement is slow and rigid, with the only evasive maneuvers granted to the player being a very short-ranged step done by flicking the left stick. Strikes are thrown the way you would expect them to be thrown, with the face buttons. A stark contrast to EA's Fight Night series at the time that relied on the usage of the right analog stick for throwing punches. Each button is mapped to a limb, kind of like Tekken, and changing the levels of your strikes are done by holding the left trigger, allowing you to do body hooks or leg kicks. And any special strikes like flying knees, Superman punches, back fists, heel kicks, whatever, are performed with the left bumper and a direction on the left stick in combination with one of the face buttons. So after reducing my first opponent to an all-jello diet, I was greeted with the main menu for career mode. This is where you'll be spending most of your time in this mode. You don't really have a whole lot of options here, only 2 really. You can either train, which will allow you to boost your strength, speed, and stamina, or you can spar, which gives you a certain amount of points that you can use to raise your finer skills, like your striking offense or your ground game.
This is where the game really starts to shine in its role-playing elements. You see, the game requires about 80% actual skill, and the other 20% is a pure numbers game. Things like denying takedowns, scoring knockouts, nailing submissions, a lot of them are reliant on your stats. If you don't have high takedown defense, beefier dudes like Brock Lesnar are going to be taking you down all day. They're going to take you for a ride that you most likely will not remember. Likewise, if you're not putting stock into your striking offense, expect that overhand right to be slamming into your opponent's face with all the weight and impact of a squeaky toy.
Yeah, I Learned this the hard way when I came up against Mark Coleman and got my shit pushed so far back up my ass that I was tasting sweet corn for the next 2 weeks. I lost because I put way too much faith in my stand-up skills and didn't devote any time to my severely lacking ground game. I thought I could just stand and bang.
Let me bang, man! I wanna do that, man. Let me bang, bro.
I was wrong. This isn't K1. This is mixed martial arts.
Now, with that out of the way, I would like to talk about the grappling mechanics. You see, grappling is performed with the right analog stick. And actually, it works really quite well. Why I've waited so long to talk about it is because for a while I didn't really understand it. I knew that the right stick did something, but I didn't have a full comprehension of how it really works.
A quarter circle input on the stick results in a minor transition. These are fast, use less stamina, but at the expense of being much easier for your opponent to block. But a half circle input is a major transition, which are slower, use more stamina, but are far harder to block. There's a heavy risk-reward element in play here, where the player has to choose between faster, more stamina-efficient movements on the ground that only get them a little further, or bigger moves that require more stamina. And while transitioning, you can't throw or block strikes, meaning you have to choose between getting a more dominant position or dealing damage.
Understanding this grappling system is what separates the boys from the men in UFC Undisputed. It's where the game really starts to come into its own and has its own sort of depth. And it pushes the game from being a slightly janky Tekken into being a true, real mixed martial arts game.
Then you get to the submission system. Oh boy. Sweet Jesus, in a Martian fuck farm do the submissions just not really work. They function, sort of. Look, you initiate submissions by clicking in the right stick, and from there, you can use the right stick to use a little stamina to lock the hold in slowly, or the face buttons to do it a little bit faster, but at the risk of running out of stamina and failing the minigame.
My issue isn't so much with the mechanics of the grappling. My issue isn't so much with the mechanics of submissions. It's rather with the presentation. There's no visual cue on how close you are to locking in your attack. No meter or zooming of the screen to show the progress of the submission. This really threw me off while attacking with subs, and defending them was just as wonky. Maybe I'm alone on this, but I like having a visual cue in my visual medium. The one thing I do like is that you can punch your way out of most holds, making it a lot easier to escape. You don't have to deal with the thumbstick too much.
So, having learned my lesson from my first loss, I decided to pump up my grappling skills so as to avoid being taken down so often like I did against Coleman. After winning most of my fights with, admittedly, some pretty awesome knockouts, I had my second loss, this time at the hands of Cain Velasquez, who proceeded to wrestle fuck me raw and pound my face like I owed him money. And speaking of the knockouts, they are fucking beautiful, actually. Scoring a KO in this game is exciting. It hits those dopamine receptors hard as fuck. Like, that shit makes me happier than Kanye West thinking about Kanye West.
They are super fucking satisfying. Especially when you score one with a head kick and your opponent spins around all Punch-Out style. Seeing them stiffen up, the mouth guard fly from their mouths as your knuckles just barely connect with the polygons of their lower jaw. And they spin like a goddamn Beyblade before crashing to the floor like a sack of drunk potatoes.
In fact, the whole game is just oozing with all the presentation of a fight. Half the time I wouldn't even skip the intros to fights because hearing Bruce Buffer's silky smooth announcer work always tickles the deepest parts of my cochlea. If a bottle of rye whiskey had a voice, it would be Bruce Buffer. Every aspect of the presentation serves to emulate the feel of the fights you see on TV, from the lighting to the ring girls between rounds, and even the commentary by Joe Rogan, and, I guess the other guy who isn't quite as famous. Now, while I have sung my praises so far, the game does have some issues, besides the grappling mechanics, There are times when Dana White will ask you to cover for an injured fighter on short notice, or sponsors will email you with photo shoots and interviews. But really all these do is give you a small boost in cred. What's cred, you ask, person on the internet? It's more akin to experience points in an RPG than it is a form of currency. You gain cred by winning fights. The amount of cred you earn is dictated by your performance as well as your sponsors. The more cred you get, the better gym equipment and sponsors you can get, but you never really have to manage your cred, so it might as well not even be there. I feel like had it functioned as a type of currency, it would have added an element of depth or strategy to the mode, where the player would have to weigh the options of a shiny new pair of trunks over a new cardio machine. Also, you can get Ultor as a sponsor, which just makes me think that this is in universe with the Saints Row games. You can't prove me wrong. Somewhere in the Saints Row universe, there's a fighter named Tom Jackson who got knocked the fuck out by Gabriel Gonzaga. Another negative is that sometimes the animation is just weird. Sometimes during a knockout they do a close-up of the fighter getting slugged and you just get this eldritch horror piece of work.
Or take a look at Anderson Silva's front kick. This is how it looks in real life.
Like we said, second to none.
Now this is how it looks in the game. Yeah, these two things, they're not the same. Seeing this kick makes me all kinds of uncomfortable. Like, I know he is called the Spider, but cut down the Uncanny Valley shit for like 1 second, please.
My last nitpick is just really how much damage fighters can take in this game. It never seems like stamina is a factor to how close you are to being put down. It always seems that no matter how gassed you are, all stamina does is dictate how many strikes you can throw in sequence. And it turns out that you can throw all of the strikes before being anywhere near exhausted. I literally used the fucking Hokuto Hakuretsu Ken on Rich Franklin here at the end of our fight and only put him out of his misery because I rocked him so many times. Like this man was already dead.
And yeah, that's UFC Undisputed 2009. It's a solid representation of mixed martial arts with some major issues. The striking is slow and a little clunky, but landing a right hook that puts your opponent down for the count is so incredibly satisfying. It just hits the right dopamine receptors. The grappling is a little awkward at first, but a trip through the tutorial helps to smooth things out. I do find that the selection of modes in this game is a little bare, with only 3 major modes to actually partake in. But, for a first attempt, this is good. Yeah, it's good. It sets up a foundation for future games to improve upon, which THQ and Ukes definitely did with the much superior Undisputed 2010. And what of Tom Big Nasty Jackson, you might ask? Well, he retired after being submitted by Minotauro Nogueira, and spent a few years turning tricks under a bridge in exchange for letting people choke him. He died of a rear naked choke.